I'm excited to introduce our first panel of the day that will be moderated by Intelligence Project Senior Fellow Kevin Ryan. Kevin will be introducing the panel, but I can guarantee all of the participants are just phenomenal as we continue to look at the military prospects and situation both over the past year, today, and looking forward. Kevin, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to everyone for taking time out of your busy days to come together with us today. Our first panel is on the military situation and prospects, and this is one side of a two-sided coin, the other side being the second panel's topics of political, social, and economic impact. So these are inextricably linked, but we are going to talk about the first, the military situation in this panel. And we have three excellent experts to talk today. Retired General Mark Hertling, Ms. Natalya Bugavoya, and Dr. Pavel Luzin. I'm going to introduce each of them as when they speak. They'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of remarks, and that should leave us some time for question and answer. So if you remember that Michael pointed out, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom connection, and that's where questions can be logged, and between Michael and I will try to get as many of those in front of the panelists and in front of the audience as possible. Well, I'm going to start with, I've asked General Hertling to start first, so let me give you just a brief introduction for Mark. He served for 4 decades in the U.S. Army, retiring as the commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, which is the main ground force headquarters for the United States in Europe. He commanded also the 1st Armored Division and Tank Force Iron in northern Iraq during the Iraq War and the surge of 2007 to 2008. Following his graduation from the U.S. Military Academy in 1975, General Hertling served in operational and training assignments throughout his career. And since retiring from the Army in 2013, he's worked as a senior vice president at a large healthcare organization, and in 2019, he received a doctorate from the Crummer School of Business, where he now serves as an adjunct professor of strategic leadership. President Obama appointed Mark to the President's Council for Fitness, Sports, and Nutrition in 2014, and in 2021, President Biden appointed him to the American Battle Monuments Commission, where he now serves as chairman. General Hertling has been a military and national security analyst for CNN and CNN National International since 2014. And Mark, over to you, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Kevin. And it is a true honor not only to be on the same panel with my friends Natalia and Pavel, but also to follow someone that I admire greatly, Dr. Hill. Kevin, you know, it's great to be here with you as well. The amount of time you served in Europe, and especially in Russia, gives you unique perspective on this issue. What I would like to do to start the panel is harken back to my final days in Europe. I spent 12 years of my 38-year career in the European landmass, worked a lot with NATO, but the last couple of years were important because as the commander of U.S. Army Europe, one of our sub-requirements, one of our tasks as part of our mission was to conduct theater security cooperation. 49 nations in Europe, of which we partnered very closely with about 36 of them. But truthfully, there were about 4, and I won't name them, that I became very close with because of the interactions of personalities between me and the commanders of the ground forces. One of those was Ukraine. From 2008 through 2012, I became friends and colleagues with the commander of the Ukrainian ground force, Colonel General Hennady Vorobyov. On one of our visits together, he would often come to Grafenwehr or Heidelberg in Germany, where I was headquartered. I would often go to Kyiv or to Yavoriv, where the training area in Ukraine is. But on one of those visits, he said he wanted to take me on more of a cultural tour after we finished our military duties. And he said he would drive me across the country. So we drove from Western Ukraine in the training area at Yavoriv, which is just northwest of Lviv, all the way to his home city, his birthplace of Kharkiv. Now, General Vorobyov had served most of his career in the Soviet Army. When Ukraine gained their independence in 1990, he became part of the Ukrainian National Guard and went back to Ukraine and rose again through the ranks until he became the commanding general of their ground forces. During that trip across the country, which we took by car, he didn't want to use a helicopter, he didn't want to use a plane because he wanted me to see the terrain. He and I were both tankers, and because we were tankers, he understood that it's more important to feel the ground. So he gave me a very good feel for the ground of Ukraine. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that as part of my initial remarks. And Kevin is allowing all three of us to provide some slides. And hopefully I won't bore you with about 7 PowerPoint slides that are mostly maps. But I thought it important to provide some details of what I think are, first of all, Putin's strategic objectives and how it is related to what I consider to be the 5 phases of this campaign that have taken place so far to set the conditions for our future engagements. All of this is my work. I've used some other people's maps. I've used Institute of the Study of War maps and some maps I pulled off of Google, but the words are mine. So if the audience finds fault with any of these things, it's just my perspective as a military guy who has spent time at the grand strategy level, trying to figure out before this war started, and as the intelligence was provided by the US and UK intelligence agencies, what the hell was Putin trying to do? And how has that been executed on the ground from a commander's perspective? So as a former theater commander, my first thought was, what are his objectives? Because I didn't know. And I came up with these 5. Mr. Putin wanted to execute regime change as part of Dr. Hill's comments about what he wants to do as an imperialist state. But in order to do that, he had to destroy Ukraine's army and subjugate their population. At the same time, though, he wanted to control all the Black and Azov seaports to establish an economic base for further destruction of the Ukrainian economy and a subjugation of their culture. But finally, as part of all this, he saw, I believe, an opportunity to further weaken what he believed to be a very weak NATO. He also was judging the political divisiveness within the United States and thought at the early stages of this war that he could use that to his advantage. Now, I put those strategic objectives to the right of this slide, but what I really wanted to do was show the map of Ukraine, because I think some of my colleagues in the media that I now work with at CNN and some of the think tankers really don't take a look at the terrain of Ukraine. It is a huge country, about 780 miles from east to west, and about 500 miles from north to south, and that's going from the southern part of the Crimea Autonomous Republic all the way to the north where it intersects with the Russian Federation. You can see from this map that the road networks and the railroad networks are not remarkably strong throughout Ukraine. I can tell you the highway we drove from Lviv to Kyiv and then on to Kharkiv, and it was a very good highway, but there weren't many roads off of that highway, as I think some of our Ukrainian counterparts will affirm. The railroads are also very unique in terms of how they support logistics. And when you're talking about a campaign, which the Ukrainian military is now trying to execute, those roads and railroads become critically important. And they also are compounded with challenges by the terrain. You can see the Dnipro River runs from near Chernobyl in the north all the way down to Kherson in the south. And in some places, that river is over 15 miles wide. In some of the smallest parts, it's about a mile wide. So the rivers itself, the creeks and the sub rivers that come off of that, they come out of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, really posed some real challenges from a military perspective of understanding terrain. Now, I'm going to make a bold statement and say that I learned early on in my career that the Army that adapts the first and the best wins the fight. I believe, and I'll show you this through the next couple of slides, that Mr. Putin has never adapted his strategic objectives. His generals have attempted to adapt the operational plans, but they have failed miserably. And it's because of several reasons, which we can talk about in a second. But let me show you how, as a commander, I would interpret those strategic goals that I had in that first slide into operational objectives from a commander, a military commander standpoint, getting orders from Mr. Putin. You can see that the main effort would be to attack Kyiv, which Putin did. The secondary effort was to destroy the Ukrainian army and subjugate the Russian people. Those go hand in hand, and they go along with a secondary effort in terms of continuing to expand the Donbass while conducting what would be called a classic Napoleonic battle of annihilation by going from the north and the south toward the major bend in the Dnipro River and surrounding the Ukrainian forces in the east. And then the final objective, as you see that broken arrow, was to head toward Odessa with forces out of Crimea and Rostov-on-Don. But I would almost suggest too that, and we're starting to hear some of this in the media today, that Mr. Putin actually wanted to continue that attack into Moldova and to reconnect with Transnistria, which has been a breakaway republic, which I watched as the commander in Europe for the time that I was there. So that was the first phase. On the as you look at this and please excuse my hand-drawn lines on this map, you see that Russia has exterior lines that we learned as a sophomore at West Point that I didn't quite understand, that was applied to our Civil War, that how difficult it was to go fight on exterior lines when the enemy had interior lines. If you go from the north in that semicircular pattern down to the south on the Russian exterior lines, I measured that distance, and it's somewhere between 2,500 to 2,700 miles. Ukraine had interior lines where they could move forces around, and they had much better training, better commanders, much better subordinate leaders, and a better doctrine and equipment in the early stages of the war. So with all the things in that tyranny of distance, from that exterior lines to the interior lines, you can see where Russia was at an immediate disadvantage. And I'll add to that, when you attack with 190,000 troops on 9 different axes of advance, where there are major cities of population bases of over 1 million in some cases, like Kharkiv or Kherson or Mariupol or Kyiv, you're talking about outweighing the troop to task ratio that the troops have to execute on the Russian side. That plan went until about the 2nd of April, when Mr. Putin called a halt and attempted to regenerate a very badly mauled military. Estimates were there were anywhere from 30 to 40,000, 30 to 40% of the initial Russian ground trooper that had been either killed or injured. He began relying much more on massed artillery. He wanted to move his forces, Putin did, back, and his generals wanted to move back to the Donbass region, continue to execute a securing operation in the south while fighting from the east. But in terms of a reconnaissance of force that would be executed before major breakthrough operations, those never came to pass. Ukraine countered with a counterfire fight, had great reconnaissance and force, counterattacked in the north and the east and pushed those forces back. And what we began to see at the same time was an expansion of the Ukrainian territorial defense, which they have been training for years, and received more mobilization. This phase 2 of the operation, which started on the 2nd of April, I believe was a battle of artillery, morale, and resources. In all 3 cases, Ukrainian army came out on top. In phase 3, the forces were set in place, and early on in the war, because of my understanding of the terrain and what were the key battle locations, those 4 boxes on the slides were ones that I put in place. And I believed at the start of this campaign, which began sometime in late September, those 4 areas would be key. Kharkiv, the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk salient, Mykolaiv and Kherson, as well as the potential for strike the naval forces of Russia in the Autonomous Republic of Korea. Russia would continue to execute a regeneration of their forces that had been mauled during the first 2 phases, and they failed miserably. But what Mr. Putin asked his generals to do was to continue to push those forces into battle, and they continued to fail miserably. It's always good, I said once on CNN, to have a really bad enemy, and Ukraine had that opportunity. The Ukraine forces used excellent deception operations and conducted attacks in the Kharkiv region. They had small-scale counterattacks across the Donbass front, as well as in the Kherson province or near Mykolaiv and beyond. And the soft operations continued to expand to strike targets behind enemy lines. Phase 3 lasted until early December, where we got into phase 4, and we saw an increased mobilization and an announced mobilization of between 300,000 and 500,000 of Russia troops on the homeland. From the very beginning, having seen Russian forces trained in some of their training areas, I knew they could not execute that number of new trainees from a reserve force in that period of time. They announced and then had a failed referenda in a couple of provinces in the south. There was continued domestic messaging, and what we see under the radar is a lot of cyber opportunities by Russia within their own population and in other populations, and an increased unrest in the Russian population. Ukraine, during this period of time, began incorporating the Western weapons that had been delivered, particularly the artillery pieces, and I'll highlight the M777s and the HIMARS. Special operations continued to act behind enemy lines, and the conventional forces in the south and the east were engaged in unbelievably difficult combat. We all know, or at least it's been reported, the extent of Russians killed and wounded on the front lines. The estimates by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is somewhere around 140,000 as of this morning. I believe it's much greater than that. They have not had the ability to move their injured troops off the battlefield. So I would suggest that there is a lot more Russians that have been dying of non-battle injury and battle injuries that haven't been treated correctly. So I would put potentially the Russian killed in action in Ukraine thus far around 200,000 or more. But having said that, Ukrainian forces have taken a great deal of casualties too. I do not have any idea of how many they've taken, but I would suggest it would have to be somewhere in the vicinity of about 100,000, and that's just a guess. The opportunities in the Donbass during this period of time of September to December has seen gradual momentum builds on the Ukrainian side. At the same time, a measured approach by Ukraine to try and counter not only the conventional arms of Russia, but also the attacks and the criminal activity of Russia striking Ukraine's civilian population. But I think we've seen a momentum in Ukraine during this period of time. So now we're in phase 5. That will go from now until whenever. The key has been to surviving the winter months on both sides. I think Ukraine has been better prepared for that. I saw a report last night that said close to 30% of the Russians on the front line are now suffering from frostbite, a non-battle injury, which is debilitating their units. But both forces are preparing for the spring. And the spring will be a race between Russian mobilization and the transformation of Ukraine's army. And what I mean by that is Mr. Putin, I think, has made an active decision to push mobilized forces to the front lines, whether they are coming from prisons or coming from training centers that have not really retrained them, but getting as many bodies into this cannon meat, as the Russian expression says, to attempt to retake ground to allow him to settle on some type of talks that he can try and trick the Ukrainian people into. There will be increased missile strikes in the coming weeks. I think we're seeing a buildup of Russian air and naval forces, and they will continue to strike against the infrastructure. The Belarus exercises, in my view, are a ruse and a demonstration. I don't believe we will see Belarusian forces entering the fight, but we may see Russian forces entering the fight from Belarus. So all of this is somewhat problematic. So while Russia continues to push newly mobilized troops that will be cannon fodder to the front lines, Ukraine is training on and developing their potential to conduct small-scale counteroffensives. At the same time, the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces has to weigh the dynamics of what he places into continuous counteroffensives with what he has to dedicate to air defense operations to protect the civilian populations. The challenge I see Ukraine's army having right now is integrating all different types of weapon systems with all different kinds of parts, repair requirements, and supply and logistics opportunities into a force which wants to go on to the counteroffensive, but will have challenges in doing so with the number of different types of equipment they have. So the final thing I would say is the Ukrainian commander is taking this time while Russia is throwing more forces into combat to prepare the battlefield, what the U.S. force calls intelligence preparation of the battlefield, to conduct those counterattacks later on in the spring. I'll stop sharing and give up the rest of my time, if there is any, back to you, Kevin. That's kind of my thoughts on the military situation as I see it from a theater commander's perspective.
Thank you very much, Mark. And that's an excellent opportunity for us to hear from a theater level commander perspective on what the Russians must be thinking about also there. Our next speaker also has a unique perspective on this, having come from Ukraine herself. Natalia Bugayova is a national security analyst, and since 2014, she's been focused on Russia. She developed and led the Russia-Ukraine research portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War. And if you haven't heard this institute's name recently, you haven't been paying attention. This is a very active and well-respected group of researchers and analysts and experts. And Natalia has been running a good part of the Ukraine effort there. Her work focuses on open source intelligence analysis of Russia's military and information operations globally. She also serves separately as the director of strategic insights at a company called Vertical Knowledge. She is the author of How We Got Here with Russia, the Kremlin's Worldview. And her work has been featured in the media, including CNN, Foreign Policy, BBC, and NBC News. And prior to working at the Institute for the Study of War, she worked on reform efforts in Ukraine after the Euromaidan revolution in 2014 in several different roles. She served as the CEO of Kyiv Post, Ukraine's independent English language publication, in 2014 and 2015. And she holds an MPP degree from Harvard Kennedy School. She's originally from Ukraine. So Natalia, we look forward to hearing your comments now about the situation in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be a part of this discussion. It's always good to be back at my alma mater and have a chance to join the conversation. I will start by building off a bit on the point about the battlefield momentum right now on the ground in Ukraine, but spend most of the time discussing the dynamics that will shape the trajectory of the war going forward. I will share just one slide potentially later a map of the latest control of terrain, but wanted to start with brief review of key milestones in terms of momentum over the past year. From February to July of last year, Russia held initiative on the battlefield. In that phase, Ukraine defeated Russia's initial objectives, and Russian offensive culminated around July timeframe, when Russia spent a lot of resources in pursuit of limited gains, including in Lysychansk and Severodonetsk area, which also happens to be my hometown. Since Ukraine has then seized initiative and launched several successive counteroffensive operations, including in Kharkiv region and, of course, Kherson city. Since then, Ukraine has been planning the next counteroffensive operations, but Ukraine's momentum has been somewhat slowed, in no small part because the delays in Western weapon deliveries have actually prevented Ukraine from fully utilizing the opportunity that Russian setbacks created on the battlefield. That also gave Russia time and space to stabilize some of its lines and add weight to its defense offensive in Bakhmut and prepare its offensive in Luhansk region. So as of last week, Russia has launched its offensive in Luhansk region on Svatova-Kremenaya line. Now, as we look ahead, I says that Russian current offensive will likely culminate without achieving decisive gains, which means that Ukraine will have another opportunity to go on counteroffensive and continue its counteroffensive campaign. Russia has been putting a lot of effort in regenerating its force in the short and long term. However, it's unlikely, in my assessment, to generate sufficient force to essentially go on a large-scale mechanized offensive, in part because Russia keeps repeating some of the same mistakes. And I will just name a couple because that's a key dynamic shaping the trajectory of the war going forward. First, we see the repetition of some of Russia's intelligence mistakes and failures that Russia keeps overestimating some of its own capability. The same nature of intelligence failures we frankly have seen in 2014, in early 2022, and throughout the past year. And I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A more, since it's a project run by intelligence series, so very happy to dive into that. The second pattern that we observe is that Russia keeps throwing a lot of resources in pursuit of limited gains, be it Mariupol, be it Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, be it Bakhmut and Uledar most recently, where Ukraine's relentless defense has actually stripped Russia of a lot of its offensive capability. And then finally, actually, the Kremlin was not willing to do what it takes at the scale and the time that was required until some of its attempts recently, and got stuck on the wrong side of the mobilization curve. I think finally, some of the capability gaps are just too large for any short-term adaptations to offset. They require fixing 20 years of cumulative mistakes by the Kremlin and not the mistakes of the past 12 months. All that is to say that I think soon Ukraine will have another opportunity to exploit additional Russian setbacks, and the West should learn the lesson and make sure that this time is properly resourced to continue its counteroffensive operations. At this phase, we assess that Ukraine still has capability to liberate its critical terrain and its people with the support of the West. Which brings me to the next point: is it is in the vital U.S. national security interest that Ukraine does, even if we remove humanitarian and moral considerations aside. Why? Because this goes to the question of the Kremlin intent. The Kremlin's intent regarding Ukraine remains the same. So frankly, towards its intent towards some of the former Soviet states, its intent towards NATO and the U.S. Whether Russia keeps or loses its gains in Ukraine is a major switch. If Russia keeps the territory, it will use it as a time and space to reconstitute its force, to launch future attacks, to most certainly try to connect military gains in Ukraine and in Belarus, which was the plan from the beginning, just the one that's delayed because Russia botched its invasion of Ukraine. if Russia succeeds at that, that will present a very different military posture requirements for NATO and major economic requirements on the US and NATO and European Union. And this is a point I want to underscore, that the path right now is either the West supporting Ukraine's continuous liberation of its people and its territories, or US facing the same problem with the same escalation risks, but in much worse conditions further down the line. The switch works the other way too. If Russia loses the terrain, actually a lot of already limited bases of Russia's power will further be diminished as we see right now. Which brings me to the next and final set of assessments I'd like to discuss, which I think will address partially some of the excellent framing that moderators presented in the beginning that have to do with the dynamics that shape the war. I would nominate three: intent, capability, and the perception of intent and capability by various parties. So if we look at the intent, in my assessment, Russia's intent regarding Ukraine is unlikely to change. Kremlin's intent regarding Ukraine has been the same for years, and it always went beyond countering NATO or capturing territory or protecting the myth of protecting Russian speakers. It was always about control. That intent remains the same. We see Putin pursuing that intent despite the battlefield setbacks. And this intent will most certainly outlast Putin by design, in part because Putin is setting conditions for the long war, but also Russian society and the power brokers are self-selecting around either explicit or implicit support of this agenda. Therefore, all the conversation about ceasefires, premature peace deals, and negotiations, they're not off-ramps for the Kremlin. They're delayed on-ramps to pursue the same objectives, just under better circumstance. However, intent is not the only thing that matters, fortunately. What truly matters is Russia's ability to sustain the war long-term, which takes us to the question of the capability. And here, I think the West has tremendous agency and opportunity to shape that capability. But to do so, I think we need to reframe and broaden the definition of Russian capability. And I would like to leave you with kind of the framework that has four elements of that capability as we look ahead. So the first element of Russian capability is actually momentum. And the Kremlin should be denied additional breathers on the battlefield, because any breather Russia uses to reconstitute its force and prepare for future attacks. As we literally see right now, that would happen over the last couple of months. Second, the breather also lessens pressure on Putin domestically. One thing we absolutely learned in the past 12 months is that the thing that actually can influence Russian information space is not Russian atrocities or Russian casualties, it's Russian battlefield setbacks. And additional battlefield setbacks will put pressure on the system that Putin relies on. And actually, I think Putin is facing a lot more risk from the people who support the war than those who do not, because he relies on his nationalist base to both sustain his regime and to continue this war. So I think any breather on the battlefield actually is dangerous for Ukraine for many reasons. Second part of the capabilities is the territory. Any territory that Russia gets to keep, it will be used for future attacks. And launching attacks from the lines that Russia has now can let Russia achieve a lot further advance into Ukraine years down the line. Terrain matters. Some terrain matters more than others, and Russia should be denied opportunity to use especially Ukraine's south as a free staging ground. The third element of the capability as we look ahead is the traditional military capability. And I think here are the two elements that are worth noting. And General Hertling already start talking about the force regeneration efforts. So if we talk about manpower and the defense industrial base, in terms of the manpower, we assess that Putin will not hesitate to throw as many men as he can into this war. We also see him actually, at least his intent, not so much yet a capability to try to reconstitute Russia's ability to fight large-scale wars. we should also not underestimate the ability of Russian society to normalize new and worse reality and get in line with Putin's intent. Break. Now, the thing that becomes really important in that case is actually the defense industrial base and ability to supply this potentially untrained or poorly coherent manpower down the road. In terms of the defense industrial base, there are a lot of good steps that have been taken by the West to curb and stop amplifying Russian defense industrial base by access to Western markets and technologies, but there are a lot more that needs to be done. And Russia continues to try to pivot to get technology and capabilities from its various few remaining partners. Which takes me to the final point within this kind of capability framework that I think we should really watch and that will really matter going forward more and more. It's the offsetting capabilities. We already mentioned one is, as Putin has experienced curbed access to the Western market, he pivots to get weapons from some of Russia's partners like Iran, economic gains from countries like India, informational gains from places like Africa. There's a lot more curbing to be done to prevent Russia from using those offsets effectively. But the biggest offset that has been really critical for Russia for years now is the information operations. It has been one of the true offset capabilities, and the West has learned to recognize and counter in many ways the Russian information operations, but we shouldn't get complacent. In fact, the fact that we still continue discussing premature ceasefires or Russian spheres of influence or taming the pace of the aid based on their own assessments of Russian escalation letter, despite overwhelming evidence over the past year, is still a testament, in my view, to how strong some of those narratives are. And as we look ahead, I think Kremlin will be investing a lot more in that capability because they understand that their center of gravity on this war is Ukraine's will to fight and the Western support of Ukraine. And as long as those two factors remain true, Russia cannot achieve its objectives in Ukraine. Now, the Western problem is not the capability problem. It's actually, I think, will to deliver that capability in the time window that matters. That assessment actually relies a lot on the perception of where the war is headed. And this is one element that Russia is trying to manipulate through the information operations to try to slow down the delivery of aid. And actually, majority of Russian information operations have been focused on that one specific, actually strategic level objective. So I think I will pause here and very happy to elaborate on any of those points, and very much looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Over.
Thank you so much, Natalia. That was an excellent follow-on to General Hertling's comments, and you're beginning to show us a little bit of what has been discussed and what is going on inside Russia as a result of this war. And that's a perfect segue for us to come and to our final panelist, Pavel Luzin. Dr. Luzin is going to throw back the curtain, I think, all the way on what's going on in Russia. So he's an expert on Russia's politics, defense affairs, and global security. He's a visiting scholar at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, and he's a regular contributor at Riddle Media and the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He has worked for Russian think tanks and American think tanks, the Peer Center, IMEMO, and he's taught at Perm State University in Russia, which is where he received his undergraduate degree. He holds a doctorate in international relations from the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, that's IMEMO I mentioned before, which is located in Moscow, Russia. And from 2017 to 2018, he worked for the presidential campaign of Alexei Navalny in Russia. Dr. Luzin, we're very happy to have you with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's my honor and pleasure to be here today. And let me start. Hopefully my presentation is seen. Russian armed forces and defense industry, 1 year of the war. First of all, we see the continuing turbulence in the Russian command structure, because the Kremlin tries to solve the contradictory task, how to make command structure sufficient, but how to preserve generals' loyalty and avoid Bonapartism among them. And this is a long-term political tradition of the Russian authoritarianism in aim to permanently prevent coup d'etat threat. And there are many historical causes, but nevertheless, we saw that, I don't know, commanders of military districts, they have been changed several times during this year. Commanders of airborne troops, they have been changed twice during the year. Even the chief of the main political directorate of the Minister of Defense has been changed once. So I presume that this turbulence may continue in 2023, but I have no any idea how the Kremlin will change this command structure next time. Currently, you know, General Gerasimov is the head of campaign. Also, the Kremlin decided to increase the number of the Russian armed forces. Since January the 1st, 2023, it formally became 1,150,000 soldiers and officers. But in 2026, it have to be 1.5 million soldiers and officers. And if we see on the long-term trend from previous years and decades, if we see the real numbers of the Russian armed forces, so we see that currently all these purposes like 1,150,000 troops or 1.5 million troops, they're just impossible. They're just impossible because currently the Kremlin is struggling for restoring the manpower that it had on the eve of invasion into Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Even there is a question of how many civilians were mobilized in September, December 2022. General Hertling said that it was from 300,000 to 500,000 soldiers. Official number is 300,000 soldiers. Some expert estimations say that there are 240,000 soldiers. But if we use the data from Bank of Russia, that is responsible for restructuring of the loans of mobilized soldiers, we cannot see more than 150,000. I mean only civilians. I don't mean those contracted soldiers that should be retired on autumn 2022, on January, February 2023, and whose contracts are currently prolonged for unknown prospect. So that's the problem of how to count the mobilization. But nevertheless, currently, even if the Kremlin is able to restore the manpower in terms of quantity, the Kremlin is unable to restore the manpower in terms of quality. So let's go next. there is a huge demographic challenge for the Russian armed forces. As you can see, today there are smaller generations of boys and young men who can be drafted as a soldiers in the armed forces. Also, you may see that the number of people who should feed the soldiers is also decreasing. So I presume that all the numbers mentioned above, I mean, the purpose of getting 1.5 million soldiers by 2026, they are just impossible because of demography. Because it's impossible to draft so many people into the armed forces without terrible social economic consequences. So next, so-called military reform that was proclaimed in December 2022, and that has started since January the 1st, 2023. The Ministry of Defense is going to get more than 500,000 contracted soldiers by the end of this year, and almost 700,000 soldiers by the end of 2026. But the original plan of 2020 was 500,000 soldiers by 2027. So I have no any idea how the Ministry of Defense is going to increase the number of contracted soldiers. Objectively, it looks impossible. Of course, the Kremlin may increase the violence, domestic violence, and Kremlin may try to force people to serve in the armed forces. But the domestic political and, again, social economic consequences will be terrible for the Kremlin. Also, the Ministry of Defense announced a significant amount of new motor rifle divisions, army corps, airborne divisions, and so on, transforming motor rifle brigades into motor rifle divisions again and again. But the reality will be just more generals instead of colonels, and more money for defense instead of real amount of new troops. Moscow and Leningrad military districts, again, more generals. Army aviation brigades, each combined army is planned to have from 80 to 100 helicopters. It's again more money and more generals. Moreover, currently, Russia didn't have such amount of helicopters, and Russia didn't have this amount even on the eve of invasion in Ukraine. So I mean, 100 helicopters in each of 12 combined armies means more than 1,000 helicopters of any type. But the Russian armed forces don't have such amount of helicopters, and the manufacturing capacity of the Russian factories is not enough to supply all these planned helicopters to the armed forces. Next, as I mentioned above, the main purpose of this so-called reform is increasing defense spending. Because as you can see, the huge increase was in 2022, and in current year, the further increase is planned. And the Ministry of Defense is going to maintain this level of defense spending. Because if you formally increasing the number of forces, you increase the defense budget. And that's the main purpose of, I presume. However, the immediate cost of the war for Russia is not counted only by national defense or national security and law enforcement budget, because as we see, Russia's total federal spending in 2022 was planned as $346 billion on December of 2021. But the actual total federal spending was $454 billion. So $108 billion it's just immediate cost of the war for Russia during the first year of this war. Next. So Russia's defense industry in 2022. Natalia already started to talk about this, but let's see on numbers. Rostec, United Shipbuilding Corporation, and Roscosmos, they are confirming their net losses in 2022. For instance, Roscosmos said that it has 50 billion rubles of net loss in 2022, almost $1 billion of net loss. And Roscosmos also said that no one factory of the corporation executed defense order in 2022. No one factory within the whole corporation. I presume the same or almost the same situation is within other state-owned defense corporations. Also, there is a deficit of workforce. Up to 400,000 workers and engineers needed to be add into the defense industry. But where are they? Where the Kremlin is planning to find them? I have no idea. Also, we see the manufacturing indexes in aviation and shipbuilding, in computers, optics, and electronics. We see manufacturing index of in electric equipment, and we see that comparing with 2021, these parts of defense industry were not successful in terms of units. The only manufacturing index that demonstrated growth was radars and navigation equipment. But this index is counted only in rubles. We don't know the number of units. And of course, if Russia faces the embargo in supply of electronic component, electric component, and so on, domestic manufacturing will increase costs. So that's why radars and navigation equipment demonstrate this growth. So it was 2022. What does Russia's defense industry have in 2023? There are several sources for increasing arms manufacturing. Firstly, the storage of components that previously was planned for 2024-2025. So currently, the Kremlin doesn't care what it will produce in 2024-2025. It's just caring about what it will produce this year, with the hope that it will be able somehow to win the war. Also, decreasing in arms trade means that there are some free facilities within the defense industry, especially in aircraft manufacturing, in air defense manufacturing, and in shipbuilding. And maybe some free facilities in battle tanks and armored vehicles manufacturing. So that is the source for domestic supplies. Also, some factories declared that they decreased number of holidays for workers and engineers, canceled vacations, and increased work hours. But I'm not sure whether or not the increase of work hours can give significant results for the Russian defense industry. But it may be discussed. And also, officially announced, it is officially announced that the Russian government is going to extend common economy model within defense industry, but it's impossible to keep the common economy model only within defense industry. Definitely, it will be extended on other sectors of the Russian economy instead of market economy model, of course. So, some conclusions. Russia's sources are limited. Restoration of military power in terms of manpower and arms seems to be impossible in foreseeable future, but we may discuss this. Further degradation of Russia's defense industry is inevitable. However, and paradoxically, the Kremlin still keeps its will to fight, and its political goals of the war remain to be the same. And Mark Hertling, General Hertling, told us these goals. It's destroying Ukrainian statehood and eliminating of Ukraine's culture. But we should also remember the history. Germany signed its surrender in November 1918 when German forces were on the French territory. And when German forces kept their will to fight. And also we should remember another example, that the superior international coalition spent 4 years fighting against the ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pavel. And I won't take any offense at you identifying the idea that the more generals you have, the worse your army is. Okay, so I won't. We'll skip over that part. But let me start by pulling together a couple of questions. There was a thread in the questions here from a couple of different people, and it was asking the question about Western aid to Ukraine and why is there some reluctance among some countries, the U.S. included, to provide certain kinds of weapons? And is this reluctance, number one, is it going to cost Ukraine the war? Or number two, could it lead to Russia and NATO having a direct conflict? Let me start with Natalia and then ask Mark to jump in, and Pavel, if you have a comment on this question. Go ahead, Natalia.
Thanks. I think 2 points on that. One, delivery of Western aid is the most critical factor right now in helping Ukraine preserve its momentum. And we've already seen the effects of Western aid being delayed. The indicators that Russian offensive will culminate start appearing already in May of last year. And it was very clear that Russian offensive will culminate soon. And I think if a lot of provisions to start supplying aid for successive counteroffensive operations started then, we would be in a different scenario now where Ukraine, having conducted 2 successful counteroffensive operations, first in Kharkiv region and then in Kherson city, could have gone on to conduct another one with the support of Western aid. So it's a critical factor, and we know what happens when there is a delay. And I think we should learn the lesson and resource Ukraine for the next windows of opportunity that we can forecast using the open and other information that we have.
And do you see the possibility of a conflict, shooting war between NATO because of that?
So a couple of things in that. First of all, Russia has already escalated with many, many means that it had, short of one that remains. And we can talk about the conversation about nuclear as well. Russia, if it could, it would have targeted Western aid. The problem is it cannot. It doesn't have that capability. So a lot of things that Russia could have done already or escalated, it simply already used those options. Second, Ukraine crossed many thresholds that Russia claimed to have been red lines multiple times throughout the last 12 months. And every time Russia simply reframed the conversation, be it, Ukraine is fighting what Russia claims to be constitutionally its territory. But the escalation from that is what is limited by what Russia can physically do. So it's not going to be different in, I think, in the provision of additional weapon systems to Ukraine. Yeah.
Okay. General Hertling, any thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, a couple of things. To address the second question first, no, I believe that Russia will not, as long as the arms are in the hands of Ukrainian fighting, even though there's been a lot of bluster from Mr. Putin saying that this has become a NATO war. He also knows he's receiving aid from other countries like Iran and China and North Korea. So this is just a support for a military in another country to defend their sovereignty, and we've made that perfectly clear. But I would, Kevin, like to push back a little bit on those who believe that there's any kind of delays in the delivery of arms. I actually think, from a military perspective, that the transfer of arms has been quite rapid, frankly. There are very few pieces of military equipment just lying around waiting to be delivered for Ukrainian use. A lot of the calculations that go into, for example, the Secretary of Defense's or the Minister's Defense of various countries, is an understanding of what their contingency plans are for their security of their nation. And I think Secretary Austin in the Ramstein contact group has been masterful in terms of persuading countries to give as much aid in various types that they possibly can. There continues to be the desire for more HIMARS, ATACMS, cannon equipment. And if you address each one of those kinds of pieces of equipment, you understand, first of all, on HIMARS, some of those vehicles were literally taken out of U.S. units, just like the Patriot missile battery. Those were active units that have a wartime mission and contingency plans. For ATACMS, I don't want to go into classified information, which I'm sure I'm dated on because it dates back to 2011, but there is a limited supply of ATACMS missiles, and they are geared toward contingency plans in other theaters on a global requirement. So I actually think, even though Ukraine has been adamant about getting more, I was interested in Pavel's slide in terms of the defense budget of Russia, with an announcement next week that I think the president is going to give that will up the amount of aid that the U.S. has provided Ukraine in the last 11 months. It will take it over $45 billion in U.S. aid. That's equivalent to Russia's entire defense budget of last year. So what I would suggest is this is a dynamic that's very difficult. And I know that the commanders on the ground, as they always do, having been a commander on the ground myself, want more. But there's, as I've said on a couple of occasions, there isn't just a wartime Kmart around where you can go and take equipment or ammunition or arms off the shelf and deliver it to Ukraine. And I think we, the United States and the NATO countries, have been pretty quick in terms of working through political dynamics to get as much aid on the ground as possible for Ukraine to transform an army that was not in the shape it's in right now before the war started.
Okay, well, before I jump to Pavel and let him comment on this too, let me push back on behalf of those who might have asked the question. So you're saying that the reason we didn't give HIMARS or tanks and so on until the time that we did give them was that either we didn't have them available or we hadn't made the decision to take away from our own stocks to do that. But there are pieces of equipment that we still have not even considered giving, at least publicly. Let's take aircraft, whether it be moving aircraft from Poland, aircraft that the Ukrainians would be familiar with flying, Soviet vintage or Russian made, or American or Western types of aircraft. And that doesn't seem to be, I mean, the conversation we would be hearing would be different, right? If it was just a question of, well, where are we going to find these aircraft? We've had countries stand up and say, we'll give the aircraft, but there's been a reluctance. Is that, can you comment on that?
I would like to comment on that truthfully, because I think early on in the war, the potential contribution by Poland of the MiG-29s was dependent on other things. And I think the United States got a bad rap on that, truthfully. I mean, it was dependent on us eliminating a sale of F-16s that were available to Taiwan to transfer them to Poland so they could then give up their MiG-29s to Ukraine. This was an advantage that the Poles were attempting to get F-16 quicker, which they had prepared to do. The other thing that has to do with aircraft, you're talking about and again, I'm speaking out of turn because I'm not a pilot, I'm a ground guy, but I do know a little bit about F-16s, and I know that it is a fly-by-wire aircraft, and it is much more challenging to train upon and to repair and to supply supplies or to provide supplies for than a MiG-29, which is a hydraulic system that the Ukrainian pilots are used to. You can train up Ukrainian pilots, estimates by the US Air Force, in about 6 months to fly F-16s. But then you have to have the entire logistics system to support those, which has been the equivalent argument used against providing M1A1 tanks or M1A2 tanks to Ukraine. The ATACMS, that seems to be the jewel of the day today. Ukraine wants more ATACMS. But I would also suggest when you're firing a missile 190 miles, you have to have targeting systems. And there was a question I saw in the question saying, hey, or in the question block saying, hey, can Ukraine withstand these constant bombardments? If we just gave them ATACMS, they could stop that. That's not quite the case, because the Russians can move their targets where they're launching these systems from all over Belarus, all over Russia, all over the Crimea, all over the Black and the Azov Sea. So what you're talking about is consistently and constantly changing your intelligence and your targeting package for a limited number of long-range missiles.
Thank you. We're at the end of our time here, so I'm going to give Pavel the last word, and you could talk about whatever you want, Pavel, but the question in front of us is, is the West support to Ukraine, is it enough? Is there a reason we should be concerned about Russia's reaction to it? And also, I'll just throw in an extra one here because you've been so patient. Somebody asked a question about your projection for military recapitalization inside of Russia. You painted a dire picture of the Russian defense industry. How many years might it take to get back to 2022 levels? Over to you, Pavel.
So towards the Russian defense industry, in normal way of its operation, it will take from 5 to 10 years, depending on type of weapon and so on. But we do have an embargo on components and also an embargo on industrial equipment. For instance, even the rocket fuel, both solid or liquid, is manufactured with using of industrial equipment purchased from Germany, Japan, and the United States. Artillery tubes, they are manufactured in Perm, in my native city, with using the industrial equipment purchased in 2011 from Austria. And there is no other source of industrial equipment for Russia. Yes. Towards this arms supply to Ukraine, General Hertling said that the number of ATACMS is classified, but I read this number on Lockheed Martin website, and the total amount of manufactured ATACMS is 3,800 missiles, and more than 600 of them have been used already. But the problem is that the original goal original way for using these missiles is completely different what Ukraine needs right now. And General Hertling also says this, that you need a completely different targeting system and so on and so on. So the West is doing everything possible. And the Western defense industry, as I can see, trying to compare this with Russian tendencies and so on, the Western military industry is increasing its manufacturing. And this year we will see a new manufacturing lines. New missiles will be manufactured. New artillery munitions will be manufactured. New battle tanks, and so on and so on. So I'm an optimist here. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to thank General Mark Hertling, Ms. Natalia Bugayova, and Dr. Pavel Luzin for kicking off our discussion here with a really great panel. The one question which we didn't really explore is about nuclear weapons. I'm going to punt that to Michael Miner and Paul Colby, and I'm sure you guys will give us the correct answer when your panels come up. Over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, and obviously the easy questions. But really want to thank Kevin for leading just a phenomenal panel that explored the military dynamics, both Russia, Ukraine, and the ongoing conflict. And thank you again, Mark, Natalia, and Pavel for joining us.